Hello everyone, this is Tommy Wren. I'm here with the Gruck for another Between Two Nerds discussion. G'day Gruck, how are you?
G'day Tom, fine, and yourself?
I'm well. This week's episode is brought to you by Prowler, the open source cloud security company. So in the last week or so, Lena Lau, who is the occasional co-host of the Risky Business podcast, wrote this blog post about taking Chinese incident response reports about a particular NSA intrusion, and she basically sort of collated them, rewrote them in a Western style and published them. Adam and Patrick had Lena on the main Risky Business podcast, and they spoke to her and interviewed her. We thought we'd dive a bit into some of the nuances or intricacies or the things that you thought were interesting that weren't like explicitly in the report.
It's a little bit of a peek behind the curtain. That's, if you read between the lines, I think it shows you some interesting stuff. And I haven't really seen that covered elsewhere.
Yeah. So Adam and Patrick interviewed Lena. Go listen to that. That was a good interview. Very cover good, different material that's more, even more nerdy.
If you want to know about the bureaucracy behind why these things are happening, you follow us.
Yeah. So the story is, like, at the very highest level, is that there was an intrusion against this particular Northwestern Polytechnical University, and the Chinese incident response firms pegged it on NSA. And they wrote these reports. Like I said, Lena translated them. But just for some context, my former workplace, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, they have this resource called the China Defence Universities Tracker. And Northwestern Polytechnical University's in there. Just very briefly, it says it does top secret research, has a very high number of defence labs and defence research areas. Is involved in illegal exports. I'm not sure what they are. It also says the university is one of the 7 sons of national defence, subordinate to the MIIT. That is the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology. So you can understand by looking at all that.
It's a legitimate target, basically.
Yeah, that it makes sense that it's a target.
This is they're closely associated with defense contractors and such, just like, MIT or any of the, Stanford and stuff like that in the US, where if they are targeted, you're not particularly surprised.
Right, yeah. And I imagine that in most US universities, there's might be research programs which would be of intelligence interest, whereas this seems more like here's an entire university which would likely have many programs that would be of interest. At the same time, you can see it's a legitimate target, but it also looks like not the highest priority. It's not Xi Jinping. Yeah, it's not the actual army.
It's not MSS, or it's not the... Yep. Yeah.
So what struck you about the report? Which is, to be clear, this is not Lena saying these things. It's her distillation from Chinese sources.
It's multiple reports. So So she collated a bunch of stuff together, wrote it up in more of a Western way, and there's a whole bunch of really interesting details that get pulled out. But there's also sort of these higher level things which I found interesting. So one of the things I was curious about is how apparently there's 3 different APTs that are identified and named by these Chinese companies. And one they associate with CIA, one they associate with NSA, and there's this third one that is not directly, according to her anyway, is not directly attributed to a specific agency or unit. So I thought that was quite curious. I can't think of who that would be. On the one hand, there's a wealth of possibilities, and on the other hand, none of them strike me as more plausible than others.
Yeah, I was wondering about how much and I don't know the answer to this question, how much of their attribution was based on material that had been leaked in like
Right.
Shadow Brokers or Snowden, and so whether like that happened
Yeah.
to fill in the gaps, and then they've just chucked another intrusion in as
Everything that's not. Yeah. Right. So there you go. They'd have everything that matches Shadow Brokers is NSA. Everything that matches Vault 7 is CIA, and everything else is some unknown third group.
which
I mean,
could
that's
actually be any country. I
yeah.
was so I was unclear based on the report
Yeah.
whether that could be true. But anyway, go on.
Right. Yeah. So like that's certainly an option. It seems like they'd been doing these instant responses for a while. They had a lot of data, and then they were able to use shadow brokers to sort of match things afterwards. Like they already had these artifacts. It was only that shadow brokers gave them specific names and directly linked them. But there's also links to some stuff from Snowden, which, like, I thought that was interesting because the diagram that they put together doesn't make sense to me, right? So, like, what they're showing is that a Chinese user, like this is our victim, makes a request to Gmail. There's an NSA server that redirects the response from Gmail and then hijacks it to send an O-Day instead. And how does that work with SSL? Like how I don't see how you can just hijack one side of a stream if it's SSL. That doesn't make sense. I don't get it.
So they've got a slide that was leaked in 2013, incorporated
right.
that in their 2022 report, even though it probably
right.
doesn't make sense.
Yeah, it hasn't made sense for
since
almost that entire
Snowden.
time. And it's a nice graphic, so I can certainly see why you'd want to include it, and it looks like a cool thing. But if they're still able to do this, then I would worry a lot more about the fact that they can intercept and inject into SSL than I would worry about that they have O-Day. Right? Like, that would be a scary capability. Some of the other stuff that just sort of stuck out to me was just how ordinary NSA is. Right? Like, they're everything they do.
You were hoping for the magic and you didn't see the magic.
Exactly. I was like, maybe these guys actually do pull a rabbit out of a hat. Like, maybe they figured out a way to make a rabbit materialize. And then you look at it and it's like, oh, there's a hole in the table and someone is feeding up a rabbit from underneath. Like, that's what everyone does. It's really...
Now, this was interesting to me, and you say ordinary, and what I interpret that to mean is that they behave like other APTs. Like, they do the same, they step through the same steps. Of whatever, initial access,
lateral escalation of privilege,
etc. And so...
the exfiltration, then they get busted, then they go again, and it's boring.
but I guess this sort of tells you that everyone's playing on fundamentally the same landscape, right? Or the same terrain or whatever, and these are sort of the fundamental things you have to do. So
if you're
is that
breaking into a network,
surprise,
that's how you. I mean, it's not. It's just I think there's two things that go into it. One of them is that they're using the standard template that everyone uses, which is, you break in, you dig in on edge devices, you have these sort of last chance implants that you use so that you can gain access after you've been kicked out, so you don't have to do it all again. You do your lateral traversal, you steal credentials rather than hacking everything from scratch all the time. Standard stuff. But what it means to me is that there's no automation, right? That
Right.
they don't have like a worm that does this. They sort of drop a piece of software in that does automated sort of crawling through the network and then collects and sends stuff back, which we know they've done in other cases. So there's that, and then there's the fact that like they have these hands-on keyboards access that's going on. There's like NOpen stuff, which is that just seems so primitive,
Right.
like
So it's not exactly clear when the events in these reports took place. So we've got a
right
very long, like, could have been from, when did it start? 2013?
to 12, I think,
Yeah, yeah. So
2012. Yeah,
over a decade. So certainly a decade ago, if you said to me, I want an AI thing to automate all my intrusion activity,
right. Yeah,
like
in
that doesn't seem
2012,
like,
if someone was saying, yeah, like we've automated it with an intelligent agent that's doing stuff, I'd be like, oh my god, the end of the internet is coming. This is it.
yeah, that's right.
I would not be impressed.
And
Whereas
like,
if
so
you
now,
didn't do that today, I would be upset. I
well,
think.
I still wonder because, I was reading about the latest U-Butte models that were released in the last couple of weeks, and the pieces I saw were, yeah, they just make up a whole lot of stuff, like
Oh god,
20% of
yeah,
references, or like
yeah,
70% for some models. And it's like, if you're a serious signals intelligence agency, someone says to
yeah, yeah. Okay, so
you,
you don't
like,
necessarily want hallucinations from like being introduced into
so
your
to me, it
intelligence
seems
stream.
we're at a
Yeah,
point where it seems plausible that this is something that could happen. But then you've
right,
got to get
right.
over how confident do we have to be to actually
Yeah,
automate it? Um,
right.
so this
Yeah,
is a
so
historical report as well of at least a couple
right.
of years. So to
Yeah.
me, that's
For
still
example, yeah, for specifically like the NOpen thing that was in Shadow Brokers, I would be shocked if they're still using NOpen
right.
from
Yeah,
2000 that was leaked in 2016.
right.
If whatever 7 years later they're still using this burn tool, that would be I would want
Very
my
weird.
taxpayer money back. Yeah,
Yep.
like I would want to know why the defense contractors haven't taken millions to write a new version of SSH. Like,
Yeah. So the question this raised for me is that the previous reports that I've, like, to be clear, I've not read them, but I've read the sort of English language interpretations of them, seem quite thin in terms of
mm-hmm.
what the incident response was doing. This has
You've
more detail and is better presented, but at the same time, it also seems like there's quite a lot of rehashing of leaked material.
right.
Now,
So
the more I
we've
think about it, the
mhm.
less I think it's possible that Chihu 360 or those other big Chinese companies are incompetent. Like they've got some very, very good people in sort of certainly
They're
exploit
super
development,
good
right?
at winning pwn to own, but somehow they don't know how to use ncase. And somehow they don't know how to do forensics, right?
Right.
So
Yeah. Yeah. That
like
doesn't seem
that
plausible.
doesn't. Yeah, there's been as you mentioned, there's been a number of previous reports, but generally speaking, those seem to have been released for politically motivated reasons.
Right.
More of you're accusing us of hacking into everything, and yet here we have a case in 2015 where you hacked into us.
Yep.
So pot calling the kettle black sort of thing. This seemed to be much more real, I guess. Like this was an actual. It wasn't motivated by a political. Well, you do it too. It seems much more of a like, here's the thing that happened, and here's how
Right.
they
Yeah.
did it, and no,
Yeah. Yeah. Lena did tell Adam and Patrick that these reports were not published on websites, but were put on WeChat. And so
right,
if you're putting them on WeChat, they're clearly not for international distribution.
yeah,
It's
yeah. That's not your target audience,
Yeah,
right?
that's right.
Yeah. So I mean, just to go back on that, this hands-on keyboards thing, that does surprise me. Right. So you've got NOpen, which was uh, like a program that essentially, let's just say it's an SSH, right? It allows you to bounce from one box to another and get a terminal session essentially, and then run commands. And the commands that you run would be automated. So it's called a click script. And this came out with the shadow brokers, where you get this, here's a script, you modify these parameters here to be with like today's date and the name of the operation that you're on, etc., etc. And then you run this thing and it sends that content as commands and pulls them off, etc. But that just seems so primitive.
But
Like,
I mean,
if I had that in 2000, I would think that was elite. If I was using, if like the NSA is using that in like 2015, which seems to be sort of roughly what they're suggesting, I would think like, what have they spent the last 15 years doing? Like, why haven't they tooled up?
Yeah, I mean, like we said, we don't think that they're using that same tool nowadays anyway.
No.
But there's no saying what's on the, what's at the keyboard end. Like, it could be...
Yeah, well,
interacting with...
Well, here's the thing, though, is that like one of the bugs that came up was when someone had failed to edit the click script. And so you got these errors showing up where there's basically, there were lines saying, modify here, showing up as like regex not found, modify here, regex not found, modify here. So it feels to me like there's still a manual process, like errors showing up like that, at least at one point in time.
Yep.
What caused this mistake? That's a human thing. So I feel safe in saying that at some point in time they were doing this very primitive thing, and it's embarrassing. Anytime between 2012 and 2022, which...
So it's not as good as you would hope they would be.
Yeah, I mean, I would have liked it to be more, I don't know, cool.
Amazing.
Yes, yeah. I wanted to be more impressed.
Right.
Is what I'm saying. And
so I think this goes back to what I said at the beginning, where they're definitely a target, but maybe they're not the highest priority target. So
it's not necessarily the A team or the B team or maybe even the C team. Yeah. I mean, I think that's one of the other things that shows up is like, so by tracing back through a bunch of bounces and hops, they found that the IPs that were being used against them were leased to a company called Jackson Smith Consulting, I think it is. Which, like, come on, like, can't you at least pick a first name and a last name, not just like... Did someone like click did they click, make a fake person and then just read it wrong? Like, it's just so little effort went into this.
But I would say that that's exactly what you want, right? If you're trying to obfuscate
just enough effort
who you are, you would let's just make a random script that comes up with totally banal names.
Yeah, yeah.
like
Smith?
At that point,
I mean, Smith. It's just embarrassing. I don't know. Couldn't they have gone from like Jackson Holdings or like Smith Amalgamated? Like, yeah. So I think the other one was similar. It was like Mueller
Diversified, yeah. So Lena's written that through joint investigation of forensics, China, something like a CERT organization, CVERC, and Chihu 360 identified 4 IPs that they say the NSA purchased through 2 cover companies, Jackson Smith Consultants and Mueller Diversified Systems.
That doesn't match my understanding of how they get access to the internet, to be honest. Although, I mean, it's not like... I'll say this. I think the Chinese probably have a better idea of what the NSA is doing than I do. So fair enough.
You would hope for the Chinese sake. Like,
Yeah.
to me, it makes sense that you would use multiple bounce hops, right? The whole point is to make it difficult to get it back to the people who you're
Right.
supposed like. So this is a mystery to
Yeah.
me.
Yeah. Sort of along those lines, one of the things that stuck out to me was, so they listed countries that had been used as bounces, and they listed they said, like, commercial companies and universities. So universities they're very popular bounces because they have good bandwidth, they have terrible security, they have a lot of crazy traffic,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't necessarily have like the highest level of security interest in stuff. Like if you say your box has been hacked, they'll just re-image it and keep going with their research because they've got better things to do than
Yep.
track down nation states. So that made sense. But the countries that were listed were like Sweden, Ukraine, South Korea, Japan. Like these
Yeah, yeah.
are
I'm looking at they've got IPs used to launch attacks. Korea, Japan, Italy, Czech Republic,
Mhm.
Mexico, Sweden, Germany, Finland, Korea. I said Korea, Spain, Japan, Australia, Poland, Qatar, UAE.
yeah.
So like quite a selection.
Yeah, and I'm curious how they do that. Like, I mean, do they hack and then use bounces, or do they rent VPS and use bounces? And I feel like they would hack because you're trying not to leave traces. Right? You're
Right.
trying to make it hard to track down who you are, and if you're using stuff that you've purchased, that's a little, you're leaving that sort of forensics evidence behind. That those financial transactions will lead back to you, and they'll find out that Jackson Smith has been doing dodgy stuff. But this is a thing that doesn't get talked about whenever you talk about like responsible cyber, or
Right.
who you're allowed to attack. And it's always like, yeah, your ultimate target company has to be, your it's always about how like the ultimate target has to be proportional, and it has to be relevant, and all these other things. It's never like, how about we don't hack kindergartens in South Korea for bounce points?
Right.
Like,
Okay. So if I was like a lawyer, or if I was in charge, my argument would be, yes, we'll hack these bounce boxes in all sorts of different countries, but there's no impact to them.
mhm.
And if there's no impact, what's the harm? It gives us an operational
Yeah,
benefit, and
yeah,
I
yeah,
can
and
imagine a lawyer signing off on that. And
yeah,
I
and
guess you sort of look
you
at the flip
know,
side.
I think that might actually be, following on from that. I think that might be relevant in that when you look at the prosecutions that happen against cyber criminals, they will say like, hit 50 different companies, causing them this much damage. As far as I know, none of those are ever the bounces that get used. It's always the actual end victims.
Right, yeah.
So it
And
feels like maybe in a little bit of a way, bounces are free. Like they don't count.
well,
Yeah.
like it's if you're like you avoid collateral damage, and this is collateral, but there's no damage.
Right.
And I mean, sort of conversely, if you look at Russian and Chinese operations, they quite often hack home office routers and
Oh, they
form
do
them
the
into
same thing.
botnets.
Yeah.
And now, I think you can mount more or less the same argument, except
Right.
sometimes those.
When they get used directly, as opposed to when they get used as a bounce, I think it's fair to say, no harm, no foul. Right? Like it doesn't. It's not a crime to install a secret SSH and redirect some traffic. Like that doesn't seem.
Well, I mean, I think it is a
I mean,
crime,
it's
but
it's technically a crime, but only because it breaks the law. But
it's to some degree, I would like it feels like a victimless crime.
Victimless crime. There we go. It's very much like it's not a big deal. Like these things happen, whatever. Everyone does it. It's just part of how you operate. That changes if, for example, you start using them to send spam or to do DDoS or
Yep.
to be certain. If you make them sort of actively involved in attacks, it's different, I think. And that seems like a reasonable line to draw. So, touching on some of the stuff that we covered last week when we were talking about these principles of hacking, access, humanity, and economy.
Mm-hmm.
I think some of the things that are showing up actually reflect those. So, as you're saying, like this is a target, but it's not a high priority target. No, it's the Polytechnic University. It's not Xi Jinping. It's not the PLA or whatever. So economy comes into effect in that you need to hit them, but you don't need to hit them with like billions of dollars of invested tooling. So yeah, like economy is going to show up in Jackson Smith consulting as just a sort of, it's good enough it's sufficient for the target that we're going after.
Right. Yeah.
Good enough. Yep.
Yeah. And I think we skipped over it, but it seems like the initial access was via phishing. So,
right. Again,
and it seems like a university, you're always going to be able to phish someone at some point. Like they're big enough.
I think at a university, you could literally just send out a piece of malware and say, for your chance to win a $20 Amazon gift card, please run this program on as many, every time you run it, you get another ticket to win. And you would absolutely succeed. I guarantee you that would work. Okay, so several years ago, there was a report from, I think it was Mandiant, about how they sort of, there's this new behavior from the Russians when they were attacking Ukraine, and that they would compromise edge devices. They would go in, steal everything, wipe everything. The target company would then rebuild. But because they hadn't cleaned out the edge device, the Russians were able to gain access, and they'd sort of do 3, 4, 5 iterations of this. And I found out recently that actually one of the ways that they were able to keep doing this was they would mask their access. So they would actually be breaking in from like owning the VPN device. But what they would do is they'd send a huge volume of phishing and malware emails, so that during the incident response, that would appear to be the way that they gained access. And I'm wondering to a degree if that might be showing up here as well, right? Because on the one hand, you've got them, using O-Day to go after things. And on the other hand, you've got them using phishing, which seems like very different levels of...
Right, one or the other.
Right.
Yeah. So I guess what the hypothesis there is that phishing is really just a cover story.
Yeah, it's misdirection, right?
Yeah.
So there's two types of deception. So a type A, or an ambiguity deception, is one where it's not obvious what's going on because there's too many different plausible options, right? So you're making it less obvious which one is authentic. And then misdirection, or a type M deception, is where rather than increasing the number of possibilities, you're narrowing it down, but you're pointing it in the wrong direction. So you're saying we did gain access. Here's all the malware that we used. It's phishing. That's what you need to worry about.
Yep.
So you're misdirecting. So it seems like that could be one of the things they're doing. But I mean, on the other hand, this is 10 years of access. I would think that they didn't use O-Day every single time.
Yeah, so Lena's sort of write-up says they had several different ways. One of them was spear phishing. One of them was the system you mentioned before, man in the middle, she calls it, and also 0 day at times. and I guess, like if over a long period of time, I suppose you expect a variety of different methods.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it seems like it's the nature of the target that, like, it is an interesting target. You want it. Like, it's definitely
Yep.
a priority, not the highest priority. So you can, and by this time they know that they're a target as well. So it's like,
Right.
well, if they know that we're targeting them,
Maybe
they know
the
that we know.
spearfishing. Yeah. Right. Right. I mean, that's sort of one of the other interesting things I think is that it probably, like, by the 10th year of doing incident response, you must have a fairly good idea of what to start looking for. Right? You must have sort of like developed a nose for like where to hunt, where to look. Like, yeah, every time they come in, they always go for our, next gen torpedo project.
Right. Yeah.
So that would be the place to start looking. Let's go and check there.
Yeah. So I mean, what's not in here is what exactly they targeted, which makes sense. But that also makes sense from the perspective of, here's the big picture target, which is the university.
Mm-hmm.
In the university, there's specific programs that we're interested in. And we want to get into those programs like very quietly. So there's kind of different levels within the whole operation, like access to the university.
Right.
Like, yeah, they know we want that, whatever. Once we're on there, it's maybe that's where the magic is.
No, it absolutely could be. And to a degree, that makes sense, right? That would be the time to do the type M misdirection deceptions, where you're saying like, oh, we're really interested in your, yeah, like we don't care about your quantum research lab. We're not super interested in your next generation torpedo program. We're very much interested in the, making canned food last longer for MREs. Like that's...
Yep. Yeah. I mean, I think the other thing is that once you're a Chinese defense university and you've been hacked many, many times over a decade, like how many different plausible attacking countries are there? Like there's probably only a small list.
Yeah.
Like Leonard actually does step through the other pieces of evidence, which were basically sort of patterns of life,
Right.
Never working on US holidays, only working during like business hours in the States.
Not even business hours. They knocked off at 4:00. Right. These guys leave early, which maybe they're just trying to beat the traffic, but
traffic is horrendous around there. But to me, that also went to the kind of target this is. In that this is a long-term strategic target. It's here today. It'll be here tomorrow. It'll be here in 5 years. Yeah. So if we lose access at 4:03 on a Friday, it's like, this can wait. There's nothing that's going to happen.
Wait for Monday. Yeah. We can take a 3-day weekend and come back on Tuesday and just get right back to it. It's not a...
Yeah, exactly. Like, no one's working weekends for this target. Whereas...
No one's missing their kids', softball game for
exactly.
Northwestern China Polytechnic.
Whereas you can imagine it'd be a different story in perhaps in counterterrorism or something like that.
Right.
Where there's more immediate...
We've lost contact with the ISIS cell in Brussels, but I guess we'll just pick it up when we come back next week.
That's right. It's Memorial Day. Well, nothing bad could happen there.
There's no urgency, I think, is what we're getting at. There's a sort of... You can come back to this when you do, and it's not going to be a big deal. Because probably, so if nothing else, the things that you're looking at that they're doing that are interesting are long-term projects anyway.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So not only is that not a particularly high priority, the stuff that they're doing is not going to be. It's not going to be ready at 5:00 on Friday. You need to know about it then.
That's right. Yeah. So the evidence that she collates and puts together, like that actually seems fair enough. If you were without all the leaked materials, you would sort of say to yourself, okay, 10 years, who would be interested
Yeah.
in this. There's a small list of countries who has the capability. Given
And
that
who
they
doesn't
never
work on
work
Memorial Day?
That's right. Okay, that seems like I would give that pretty high confidence anyway.
Yeah, I would go for it. I mean, I think I think you hit on the key things, which is like, who would be interested for 10 years and keep it up
Right,
in
yeah.
a way, right? Like that's if someone breaks in and like messes around, they get caught and they get kicked out and never come back. Probably it's a teenager or
Could be
something. You know,
anyone,
like
yeah.
you can, yeah, not particularly interesting. If someone gets found, comes back, gets found, comes back, gets found, comes back, after some number of years, they are persistent, right?
Yeah, yeah.
They definitely,
After some number of years, you give them a name. They have a personality. They're
right.
like an old friend or frenemy that comes back. I think there's
Yeah.
like the people in there would get a feeling and they'd speculate
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
they would build up these sort of chains of evidence. And
Yeah. And it absolutely.
I feel like the sort of the working hours
Mhm.
and the length of time goes to that
Mhm.
economy principle where it's like this is clearly an enduring priority,
Yeah.
a priority, but it's not the highest priority.
Right.
And it seems like the types, like I kind of get the like I very much get that feeling from the way this operation is described, that it's bog standard
Right.
target.
It's your bread and butter
Yeah,
sort of stuff. It's very, day in, day out. This is what you're doing, as opposed to like we've got a flash thing that we need to, absolutely. Yeah, it's. I think in terms of access, one of the things, we touched on it briefly, but just the use of passwords and stealing credentials. This is one of the things that comes up, like every time there's someone from the NSA or wherever who gives a talk about how we do things. They talk a lot about how they'll just steal passwords. Like make sure you've got multiple factor authentication.
right.
Nation states love using credentials, and it always feels like you always get a sense that they're talking about like the other guys do. I mean, we have magic. Okay.
So Lena's blog post actually got a lot of attention, and I guess it's because people are interested because it's a peek behind the curtain of what NSA
Right,
actually does. But the more we talk about it, the stronger and stronger feeling I get that it's like, just the sort of average workaday,
Yeah.
mundane businesses.
It's just-
not that important business as usual peek behind the
Right.
curtain, which is kind of disappointing in a way.
Yeah, it doesn't feel NSA.
Right,
like
right,
it doesn't feel special. There's no glitter. There's no
I think
sparkle.
there's this. I think there's this interesting dynamic where what we're really wanting from this kind of report is something sensational,
Right, right.
but it's come from, like, I feel like it's kind of just a very mundane target.
Yeah.
And like, ironically, I don't think we'll ever get that sensational report, because if the sensational parts get hacked, they're not going to release instant response reports.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And so Lena will never translate them. We'll never get to see them. And so that's what we're just left with, the banal
We're
hacking of a
condemned.
university. Yeah.
Yeah, we're condemned to a lifetime of 9 to 5 hacking jobs. That's
Thanks a lot, Gruck. 9 to 4.
9 to 4.
Not even.